Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video.
Blackcrown had fallen. Again. He'd never been his father's favorite son, despite his efforts to be the best reaver this side of Dagmar Cleftjaw. Long days spent as an oarsman aboard a longship, followed by evenings training with his sword and axe, had left him lean and scarred, yet still his father paid little attention. His raids in the Summer Isles, deemed extraordinary daring and dangerous by all of his men and others besides, had been met with a simple raised eyebrow and hand wave of dismissal. He was the expendable son. That was why he was given command of 30 longships at the beginning of this war, to go and smash them against Old Town's trebuchets or the Arbor's galleys, to at least die as an Ironborn, even if Iron King Balon never considered him one. Prince Theon Greyjoy hadn't died. Instead, he had become the Blood Kraken. He'd taken Old Oak in the dead of the night, his reavers sailing into the docks with muffled oars and swarming the small port city and castle nearly before the Oakheart lords had any notion they were there. He'd sacked the ancient castle and then rode to Oakenshield, finishing off what his uncle Victarion had started, battling over the walls and into the heart of the castle. He'd taken Lord Hewitt's buxom bastard daughter, Phalia, as a salt wife, and on her pleas had also claimed 2 of her true-born sisters. Theon had at first thought she meant it as an act of mercy, saving her sisters from the iron-born underlings, but Phalia had quickly proven that notion a foolish one. She was the first woman he'd ever met with a deviant side as broad as his own. Theon half fancied himself in love. The third son of Balon Greyjoy had learned of the first's death shortly after the fall of Oakenshield, his eldest brother Roderick having met his fate, a well-deserved one in Theon's mind, at the end of a Mallister's blade. His other brother Meryn was engaged with the Presters of Feastfires, both Ironborn and Greenlander refusing to give up a vicious siege that had gone on for months. The Lord of Feastfires, Garrison Prester, had been killed leading a sortie against the Ironborn, and his second-in-command, a cousin named Forley, had died with him. Instead of weakening the Westerlanders, it seemed to have instead strengthened them. A raven-haired daughter of Lord Garrison, Sixanten Elinor Prester, had taken over command of the defenses, and by all reports was wreaking more havoc than either her father or male cousin had been able to. Ironborn numbers had dwindled so severely that Meryn had called for aid, something Theon knew his older brother wouldn't have done if at all avoidable. It was unseemly for an Ironborn to call for any type of help, much less when facing a woman. Theon loved it. One of his brothers had gotten himself killed while the other and an uncle had been shamed, while Theon was covering himself in riches, women, and glory. Minor captains had steadily been flocking to his command, inflating his numbers to near 4 times the size they had been at the beginning of the war. At this rate he would have to be more wary of a Shad during a Kingsmoot than Meryn or Victarion. That was probably the case in any instance, but that was neither here nor there. His sister was trying to hunt down the Red Wine fleet, which had been playing cat and mouse for ages, while their father had been raiding Dorne-scorched coasts while he waited for the royal fleet to arrive. No word had been had from any of the easternmost fleets in several weeks. But a Shah had always been secretive, and the Iron King normally deemed it below him to keep his followers up to date on his activities. If Sunspear, the only target of true worth before the Stormlands, had fallen to anyone, word would have spread by now, as would news of the galas of the Iron Throne appearing. Theon imagined the royal fleet had likely already been smashed by his father, and that Balon Greyjoy was sailing towards the riches of the eastern coasts. Victarion, still seething at having his nephew sail up and take his glory from him, had sailed off to answer Meryn's call, likely in hopes of reclaiming some of his own renown, and further damaging Meryn's. Theon had sailed the opposite direction alongside a fleet under Dagmar Cleftjaw, to retake Blackcrown from the Reach forces that had driven the original Ironborn out. While everything of value had been removed during the first taking, it would serve as a warning to the Reachmen that none of the Greenlands was safe, and that it would take more than a token force to hold any keep this side of Dorne. Theon also hoped it drew forces away from his ultimate goal, which to this point had been too well defended to even contemplate attack. He was going to take Old Town, right out from beneath the pompous high towers. He fell asleep every night, Phalia on one side and one of her bound sisters the other, with dreams of the glory to come. It was from that sleep he awoke to word that a fleet had stolen up on them in the night, engaging Dagmar just off the coast of Blackcrown. The sound of the battle was fierce even from shore as Theon and his reavers rushed to man their ships. As he sprinted towards the docks, Kraken helm in one hand and bow across his back, he could see the blue sails with clusters of red grapes. Red wine seems to have given a Shah the slip long enough to hit me. Theon's heart soared. It appears my sister shall be put to shame during this war as well. To oars, he shouted as soon as he stepped aboard his longship, aptly named Glory Seeker, rather needlessly as his men were already pulling out of the docks. We crushed the red wines today. Dagmar had already been holding his own against the red wine fleets by the time Theon's came barreling in. Arrows and grappling hooks flew between ships. Theon ordered the Seeker up beside one of the largest galleys with the red wine sail billowing. The Reachman galley sitting a full 2 decks higher than his own longship. Regardless, his men tossed grappling hooks, and Theon picked off 2 enemy archers with his bow before he reslung it and hauled himself up and over the side of red wine vessel, axe and sword soon covered in blood. 2 other ships of lesser captains had likewise assaulted the red wine vessel, and before long the scores of Ironborn had painted it was red as the grapes on her sails. Theon removed his axe from the brain of a Reach sailor, barely noticing the carnage as his men and those of the other captains mopped up what was left of the red wine men. He strode towards the forecastle, dispatching a wounded man in blue and yellow along the way, using the height of the massive vessel to look over the battle at the sea. What he saw froze his blood. Approaching from the direction of Dorne was a fleet, their sails turning the blue of the sea into an ocean of colored cloth. But those sails belonged to neither his father nor his sister. The ships too wide in the water and tall in the mast to be reavers. Those were galleys, not longships, too many of them to be prizes captured, all sailing towards Theon and the remnants of the red wines. At their front the largest of the galleys sailed, its deck adorned with scorpions and her rigging with marksmen. Her mainsail flew the crimson dragon of Aegon Targaryen, her top sail the black stag of Baratheon. The royal fleet had arrived. For a moment Theon could only stare, mind unable to process the implications of the royal fleet's sudden arrival off the western coast of the Reach alongside the red wines. His father was supposed to have met them south of Dorne. He and Ashak combined would have had too many ships for a Greenlander to defeat, and even if by a miracle one had, there would have been survivors to bring the tale to the rest of the Ironborn. His father and his captains were too experienced at sea to fall. And they were expecting the royal fleet. They weren't likely to have been taken unawares. Yet here his enemy was, and the Iron King was nowhere to be found. Shouts of alarm began on the deck around him as more and more Ironborn became aware of the approaching fleet. Several captains were turning towards the new threat, while others were shamelessly beginning to edge their crews away from the battle. Theon understood why. This piece of the red wine fleet had clearly been a distraction, drawing the Ironborn into a disorganized mass of ship-to-ship combat. The royal fleet then bolted in, organized and fresh, to smash them. To smash Theon. Greyjoy knew then he was going to die. His mind was a blur of images as he raced back to Glory Seeker, refusing some of his crew's pleas to flee. His Ironborn made a fight of it, sinking and burning 3 more ships before the massive black hulk and black sails of the royal flagship loomed over him. He saw Dagmar had also been drawn towards the flagship, and both Ironborn made to board her simultaneously. No communication had both boarded the royal flagship, both reavers making a last-ditch effort to remove the head of the snake so that the body would die. Scorpion bolts tore through his longship and arrows through his men as they boarded. And as soon as they gained the deck they were set upon. It wasn't sailors who met them, but instead knights and experienced men at arms, some dressed in full armor despite the fact that it would drown them should they be cast overboard. His uncle Victarion, who also dressed in full armor, would call them brave, but Theon considered them stupid. But either way, brave or stupid, they were deadly. Theon saw the Cleftjaw die, a Greenlander mace turning the ugly scar of his face into an uglier mass of blood and bone, knocking the infamous captain to the ground where the mace wielder proceeded to smash his white-haired head in. It was a different man, in black and gold armor with stag antlers on his helm, who killed Theon. They battled for what seemed like hours, Theon quick and elusive with his axe in one hand and his sword in the other, while the muscular Greenlander, clearly a Baratheon, was savagely strong with his sword and shield. It was Dagmar who ultimately caused his doom, the Prince of the Iron Islands slipping on the old Ironborn's blood and going to a knee. The Baratheon's sword had knocked aside his axe and then removed his head before Theon Greyjoy could even think to scream. The Bloodkraken's head bounced once, twice, thrice across the bloody deck before it dropped into the murky sea. They arrived a fortnight after he'd left them standing in a field. There was no pomp and circumstance for this meeting. No show of strength. Jaehaerys Targaryen, accompanied only by Lord Commander Mormont, Sir Boren of the Kingsguard, Robb Stark and their 2 direwolves rode to the edge of the clearing in front of the wall. There they were met by Mance Rayder, the big red-bearded wildling known as Tormund Giantsbane, the giant himself called Mag the Mighty, and the disturbingly beautiful blonde-haired woman called Val. No snow bears came from the woods, no squat women waved impaled dog heads around, and no line of knights on horses peered down from a position of superiority. The two sides simply met and once again started to business. Snow fell around them, a near constant thing now, as Mance Rayder once again pleaded his case. I brought your proposal before my people. Jaehaerys nodded, and Rayder's tone was tight with barely controlled anger. I lost nearly 100 men in the brawls that broke out. My people refused to kneel. I'll take that as a no then. Rayder raised a hand. You didn't let me finish. His voice lowered with his hand. I lost near 1,000 more when the dead hit us that night. We burnt our own as soon as they fell, but then the same evil we've been running from caught up to us. My people are on their way here whether that gate is open or no. Jaehaerys' throat was dry, but he kept his face calm. You know my terms, they will not change. Mance raised his chin a hair. You seem like a smart lad, even for a southerner, but you're being foolish. I just told you the dead are nearer than any of us would ever want their like to be, yet you'll let me bring the only thing between you and them down before you let my people through. He shook his head. Quite the contrary, you would bring down the only thing between me and them before I let your people through. The red-haired giantsbane spoke, voice deep and raspy. The free folk don't kneel. Southerner, we nearly tore one another apart when the idea of it was mentioned. Mance nodded. There are those who would rather die than kneel before any man. Jaehaerys swallowed, then spoke the words he had been preparing to say for weeks. Then let them. The king beyond the wall seemed insulted. Leave my people to die? Not all of them, the Targaryen prince cut in before Rayder could work himself into too big of a lather. Just the ones who won't swallow their pride enough to save their people's lives. Any man who wouldn't kneel to save his family is not a man I want anything to do with. If they would refuse my offer and doom the rest of you, leave them. Those of you who would kneel and follow the commands of the king are free to come below the wall, though with the stipulations mentioned and a few others to boot. Giantsbane grunted. And what do we do when those we leave come knocking on your wall? Jaehaerys met the bigger man's eyes. Nothing, you do nothing, I do something. And just what would you do? Jaehaerys tried his damnedest to embody Aelor in that moment. I'll give them what they want, death. Mance spoke, voice still on the edge of control. Those who refuse to kneel pick me as their king just as those who were open to the idea did. And those who follow a king obey that king or he is no king at all. They chose you to follow. If they choose not to do so in this, then your hands will be clean. And yours will be those of a murderer. Jaehaerys didn't let his face flinch, though his insides certainly recoiled. No, it'll make mine more kingly than yours ever could be. Jaehaerys gestured behind him towards the wall that towered behind them. That is the key to your salvation. I hold it. I can give it to any of you who choose to follow my commands, and I can just as easily withhold it from those who won't. I have made my position clear, Mance Rayder. The king beyond the wall spat. And I've tried to make mine clear as well, but you won't listen. The threat I'm running from is far greater than the one my people represent, and I have a wall to defend against it. I warned you I would bring that wall to the ground if I have to. Jaehaerys rose to his full height. Then do it, and we'll all die together. For just a moment, Jaehaerys thought Rayder would strike him. Ghost and Grey Wind sensed it, both direwolves stepping closer to the Prince of the Iron Throne and growling low in their throats, while Boren and Robb stepped forward with their hands on their swords. Rayder didn't move to attack though, his eyes locked on Jaehaerys as his mind clearly raced. The Prince of the Iron Throne met the gaze, refusing to buckle even as his breath caught in his throat. It was several long minutes before Rayder let out a long sigh. What are these other stipulations? And it had all been going so well. King Viserys Targaryen's war effort had been achieving nearly unprecedented success. He'd taken King's Landing almost bloodlessly for his side anyway, and several houses had sworn for him. While his cousins and sister had escaped him, his nephew and uncle had both been beset upon by the same snows that now covered his city. While his scouts couldn't infiltrate the snows well enough to keep track of numbers or exact positions, it was common sense that Aegon and Aelor were suffering severe attrition. Their animals were certainly in danger, and if Viserys could engage them with an overwhelming cavalry superiority, he would have the clear advantage. Over half the north and a large portion of the strongest southern levies were at the wall. The Reach armies and shattered remnants of the Westerlands were busy trying to rid their coasts of the Ironborn, nearly the entire coastline falling at some point or another to the Reavers. The forces of the Riverlands and Vale were split, a large portion of their strength also trying to contain the Ironborn, while the rest had gone to try and unite with Aegon. Malo Jane and Black Balak had taken a detachment of several thousand Golden Company mercenaries to harass them, and the Summer Island archers had succeeded in slowing them considerably. Dorne had been subjected to enough Ironborn raids that they had been forced to protect their borders, while the presence of Elia Sand in King's Landing kept Prince Oberyn Martell and his 15,000 Dornishmen in the Boneway. Yes, despite the slight setbacks, Viserys' war had been going swimmingly, until a handful of battered longships had sailed into Blackwater Bay, bringing with them devastating news. Asha Greyjoy was long-legged and lean, with black hair she kept chopped short. When she disembarked, her right arm had been in a makeshift, blood-stained sling, the bones had been nearly pulverized by a warhammer, and the physicians seemed intent on removing the arm before the infection already running rampant through it took her life. The Lady Reaver was just as adamant that they didn't take it, and it had taken ordered force from Viserys to save her life. Ordered force had taken her father's. Viserys knew Stannis Baratheon was a hard, unyielding man, totally unlike his younger brother Renly. While Viserys had been granted the reconstructed Summerhall a few years before the Lord of the Stormlands had come to the capital as master of ships, he still knew the elder Baratheon's reputation. He had eaten boot leather rather than surrender Storm's End to Mace Tyrell, and had made no excuses to try and save his life when judgment was passed down by Aelor Targaryen. The only reason he hadn't died at Storm's End was the interference of Ned Stark and the fact that Renly would have to die with him. Yet still, Viserys hadn't expected Stannis to be as patient and calculating as he had been. Storm's End wasn't overly far from King's Landing, particularly by sea, and it was there that Lord Stannis' children and wife awaited the end of the war. While it was considered nearly impregnable, it certainly couldn't have been easy for Stannis to resist either rushing back to protect his castle or rushing forward into battle to try and end the war quickly. He had done neither. Iron King Balon Greyjoy had been raiding the south of Dorne while he awaited Stannis' arrival. Lord Baratheon had proceeded cautiously, hugging the coastlines and keeping in contact with the lords of Dorne. Balon Greyjoy had kept his navy mostly intact aside from the attachment under his daughter, who was chasing the Redwynes back and forth. After a few weeks raiding around the curve of the Reach as they waited, he had proceeded to Dorne and there had sacked Starfall, home of the ancient House Dane, though the Danes themselves had simply evacuated ahead of the Ironborn scourge. Intermittently they raided villages, slaughtering small folk, before sailing up the Brimstone to attack Hellholt, home of House Aelor. Thrice he attempted to take the castle and thrice he was repulsed, though he kept the bulk of his navy scouting for Stannis. When the royal fleet was finally sighted, he abandoned all other raids, consolidated his fleet and took off after them. Stannis had retreated from him outnumbered without the Redwynes, into the small bay of salt beneath the walls of Scorched Rock, the seat of House Ladybright. Iron King Balon, believing Stannis trapped, had sailed in after him. And there he had died. The Ironborn were better sailors than the men under Lord Baratheon, their entire lives spent on the decks of ships. In open fleet combat even unyielding Stannis would have fallen, his ships burned to the watermark and body feed to the sharks. So he hadn't fought Balon in open ship combat. He had pulled him against the coast and there he engaged them, as did the Dornish. In the weeks it took him to finally involve Balon Greyjoy, Stannis had been working. While the details in their entirety were unclear to Viserys, it was reasonable to assume he had disembarked on multiple occasions, likely treating with the various lords of Dorne. However he had managed it, the Dornish had trebuchets and catapults in the hundreds waiting on the cliffs of the Scorched Rock. Hell had been unleashed on Balon Greyjoy. The fleets had met under a backdrop of flaming barrels of pitch and burning bolts. The Ironborn hadn't withdrawn. Be it brave or stupid, Asha Greyjoy questioned if her youngest brother's successes, a thorn in her father's side, may have played part and might have won the day despite the volleys of Dornish fire, until the Redwynes arrived. Asha doubted that had been part of Stannis' plan, for she had finally caught up to the fleet of the Arbor. Lord Paxter had one moment been fleeing a different direction, the She-Kraken on his heels, and then had turned abruptly and followed the sounds of battle. Asha had been unable to run him down before his men, for months having been on the run, finally were able to attack. They had torn into the battle in the bay with devastating effect. By the time Asha's own ships joined the fray, her father's fleet had been mostly demolished, and it didn't take her long to see the day was lost. Her own fleet was mostly demolished in its efforts to escape, her personal crew having to repulse 4 separate boarding attempts before they made open water and fled back around the Arm of Dorne and up towards King's Landing. Viserys' council had been debating so hotly in the weeks since that Viserys had a constant headache and the overwhelming desire to drown himself in wine. For the last time, he's still outnumbered. Our plans can continue as discussed. Harry Strickland had been adamant that they make no adjustments to the intent to wait for Aegon to come to them, and his points were sound. Asha Greyjoy had reported that even though he had been the one to set the trap, Stannis' fleet was still heavily damaged, as were the Red Wines. His lack of even token pursuit of her backed the claim. And for the 100th time, outnumbered is a stretch. Jon Lothston had been ferocious in his request to sally out and eliminate Aegon on land before Stannis could win more victories on the water, likely because it was the opposite of what Strickland wanted. We don't know how many ships he and the Red Wine fleet lost when the idiot Greyjoy got himself killed. All we know for certain is that they are now unified while the remaining Ironborn are scattered. Surely word of their king's death would have spread, pointed out Renly Baratheon, who couldn't have taken word of his brother's impressive victory well. Part of his claim was that he could make men follow him when his brother couldn't, yet the elder had been the one to annihilate an enemy force in fair combat. Lothston world. How can we be certain? Lady Greyjoy says the Red Wines came from the west. Any stragglers would have been caught in their attack. The Reach and Dorne are nearly unified under Aegon, and they aren't going to go telling the remaining men raiding their homes that there's a threat nearing them. So what do we do? Asked Lord Lorimer Payne, lean and stately. Help Aegon Targaryen dig himself out of his snowstorm and attack. Why not just wait for the weather to do our work for us? It's likely he's nearly dug himself out already. But we cannot wait for him to reach us because by then Stannis Baratheon may have defeated the rest of the Ironborn, and then we're well and truly fucked. With no threat to their borders, nothing will stop the armies of the Reach and Riverlands from coming straight for us, and with them the Vale. We need to destroy their king now, while we are at least close in number if not superior in that regard and better equipped. With Aegon and Aelor dead, King Viserys is the logical successor. What of Jaehaerys at the wall surrounded by 10,000 Northmen under the Starks who are his kin? The wildlings will take care of him. And if they don't, we will handle him in time. Besides, he is a bastard, regardless of whether Aelor or Aegon Targaryen want to admit it. Renly scoffed. A bastard who has been the heir to the Iron Throne since the day of his birth. Your plan is filled with more holes than the Iron Fleet. A voice came from the door of the chamber, Lysono Mar's tone a mixture of annoyed and concerned. It is about to gain more credence. Theon Greyjoy is dead, as is another sizable portion of the Iron Fleet. A chorus of groans filled the room and Viserys cursed aloud. Baratheon again? Mar nodded. Stannis engaged Theon off the coast of Blackcrown and shattered his fleet. Meryn Greyjoy, who I suppose is the king of the Iron Islands now, managed to slip a messenger through the Reaver holdings of Cornfield and our land on the Gold Road. He's ordered his fleets to muster together. They won't stand a chance piecemeal. Viserys ran a hand through his silvery blonde hair. That means most loyalist forces are about to be freed up. It was a terrible blow to Viserys' war effort, but Lothston looked nearly giddy. Surely you see my suggestion is the best course of action now, your grace. If all of our enemies band together, even the walls of King's Landing and the presence of hostages will not stop them. Our entire strategy was to keep them occupied until we remove Aegon and Aelor Targaryen. Now is that chance. Strickland clearly wasn't convinced, but Viserys doubted he ever would be. And leave King's Landing, our only symbol of power, free to the Dornish. Duncan Strong, thus far quiet, chimed in. We can kill the hostages. If they are to recapture King's Landing for time, we can make that victory taste foul to them. Viserys shook his head. Absolutely not. Unnecessary cruelty is what brought me half my army. I will not subject to it myself. If I have to surrender King's Landing for a time to eliminate my rival, I will do so. Viserys hunched over the table, peering over the map of Westeros. While my nephew isn't free of the neck yet, he is certainly close. There is only one way out of there, and then there are limited crossings for him to take. The crossing itself or the Ruby Ford. Renly had joined his chosen king in posture, gesturing towards the two towers symbolizing House Frey. Lord Walder hates the Tullys, but he hasn't sworn for us. I doubt he'll bar Aegon from passing. I agree, though he has no need of crossing there. If he does, he'll just have to ford another of the forks farther down. If he crosses at the Ruby Ford, though, he'll be only a couple of days from Harrenhal. It's defensible even if it is a ruin, and I'd wager it will be the chosen location of my brother and nephew for their base of operations until I am dealt with. There is a certain poetic brilliance to it all. Strickland tried once more. Your Grace. This is our strongest position. Viserys glared at the Captain General of the Golden Company. And I have sat in it for months and received nothing in return but a weakened position. Lothston has the right of it. Now is the time to strike. If I allow the Vale and Reach to consolidate, I am finished, even if I have elephants and professional mercenaries on my side. Your Grace, enough. Viserys stood to his full height. I have allowed you all to plan nearly all of my moves to this point, but I am Viserys Targaryen, not you. We march on my command, and I command it. You can obey or you can die. That goes for you all. He slammed his finger down on the ruby ford. This is where I will meet my nephew and brother in battle, and this is where I shall end them. A good king led by example, and while Mance Rayder didn't fit any Southerners' expectation of a king, he also didn't ask anything of his people he wouldn't do himself. The king beyond the wall strode towards the contingent waiting at the northern base of the wall. Snow was falling heavily. The sky so dark, despite it being midday, that he carried a torch. 2 women came with him, one clutching a heavily furred bundle to her body, the other easily recognizable as Val. Jaehaerys awaited them a few feet from the great door in the wall, a retinue of 20 knights supplementing his normal advisors. His uncle Eddard Stark had arrived from the Night Fort only hours earlier, Jaehaerys wishing the presence of the current Warden of the North for this unprecedented move. His uncle Ned had given nothing away, and Jaehaerys informed him of his intent to allow the wildlings to pass through the wall. The quiet wolf's face had remained blank, stark features as cold as ice. He didn't complain, didn't curse Jaehaerys. He simply accepted it for what it was. While happy he hadn't, Jaehaerys almost wished he would have exploded in anger, though he had never seen Ned Stark show any sort of emotion aside from love for his family. The men of the Night's Watch certainly had, as had most of the northern lords stationed at the wall. Jaehaerys imagined he was the most hated man in the north with Stark blood since the rebellious House Greystark. Even Lord Commander Mormont, who had been by Jaehaerys' side through all of the negotiations, had expressed his serious misgivings when it became clear that it would actually happen. Jaehaerys had had to defend his point over and over, and if not for his uncle's silent acceptance, which had been all that had stayed the other northern lords, Jaehaerys was fairly certain he would have had an all-out rebellion on his hands, but Jaehaerys was willing to accept that hatred if it meant saving all of those women and children from the true enemy, an enemy Jaehaerys was growing more and more certain was real. He hadn't seen it himself, nor did he wish to. But the stories were too many and the evidence too much for him to maintain doubt. If the stories of terror were false, he would look like the most gullible man this side of the narrow sea. But if those stories were true as he believed, whatever their difference in culture, the people north of the wall were still people, and something else was killing and reanimating them. There were innocents, children and babes who could be saved. It was an odd parallel and deviation to his uncle Aelor. Jaehaerys was doing all he could to save an enemy because of the innocents among them, while Aelor would slaughter them all if it meant the destruction of his foe. Yet both men, honorable nephew and ruthless uncle, would accept the hatred of an entire world in order to do what they deemed best for their family. He was pulled from his musings by Mance Rayder coming to a stop in front of him. Face clearly unhappy with the ramifications he was to suffer but left with no other choice. The woman to his left, clutching an infant to her chest, looked much like Val on his other side, and Jaehaerys knew at once they were sisters. I knew the wildlings considered Val a princess, but I always assumed she was Mance's sister. It appears I was wrong. Mance gave Nom pleasantries. My wife Dalla and my son. If a hair on their head is harmed, I wouldn't invite thousands of wildlings to my side of the wall if I intended to incite them to violence. Jaehaerys cut in. He peered at the big, clearly healthy child in Dalla's arms. What is your son's name? Val spoke in answer, her tone sharp and commanding. It is considered bad luck in the true north to name a child before 2 name days. She took a few steps closer to Jaehaerys, prompting Sir Boren to move to intercept. The Prince of the Iron Throne raised a hand to stop him, raising an eyebrow at the blonde wildling. I am going with my sister, wherever she and my nephew go. If you try to do as you threatened, you will find wildling women don't go as quietly as southern ones. Jaehaerys felt a touch of shame at the mention of it. While his entire intent in all of this was to save the innocents on that side of the wall, he had had to threaten the opposite to ensure wildling cooperation. Jaehaerys had funneled Aelor. Each of the clans would give 15 of their young over to the Targaryen cause, before any adults were allowed to cross through the gates, including at least one of the chieftain's children. Jaehaerys had told Mance in no uncertain terms that if the wildling force stepped out of line, those children would be executed on the spot. It was an act reminiscent of his uncle that Jaehaerys couldn't go through with, even if it meant his life and the life of everyone at the wall. But Mance Rayder didn't know that. Jaehaerys had cultivated an unforgiving and unyielding personality when dealing with the wildling leaders, one augmented by the fact that even those north of the wall had heard of Aelor Targaryen's willingness to commit such an act. For all any of them knew, this Targaryen was just like that one, and the men who knew Jaehaerys wouldn't go through with it. Ned Stark, even Lord Commander Mormont, certainly weren't going to tip the prince's hand. As it was, Jaehaerys met Val's devastating green gaze coolly. If your people follow my orders, it won't come to that. I pray it doesn't, but even the 7 won't stop me. They won't have to because the 7 already know I couldn't do it. Jaehaerys looked to Raider. The Horn. Mance's eyes were alight with rage, but he knew he was in the position of inferiority. It will remain in my camp until the last of my people are through. I won't give you all of the leverage. Targaryen. Jaehaerys dipped his head. Fair enough, how many of your people didn't agree? The king beyond the walls gritted his teeth. More than I care to tell you, though I expect you'll be seeing them before all of this is over. I've got my own people, the ones I have left, keeping a sharp eye out for when they undoubtedly try and attack. More of them would have rebelled if it wasn't for the dead beginning to hit us every night. He raised a chin. None of them take well to being threatened. Your threats won't be forgotten. Jaehaerys rose to his full height. Excellent, if they aren't we should get on swimmingly. He waved a hand and the tunnel behind creaked as the great ironwood doors were opened. If the dead are as close as you say, I see no need to hesitate. Slowly, sometimes by themselves and sometimes in groups, the hostages came forth. Aemon, his cousin, not his ancient uncle, and Samwell Tarly kept a brisk record, writing the names and tribes of each of them as they came forward. Mance stayed beside Jaehaerys through it all, saying nothing to the prince who had outbluffed him. The prince of the Iron Throne didn't attempt to break it, letting the king beyond the wall stew. Jaehaerys knew he had made no friends of the wildlings by his actions, but he hoped he had at least saved some of their lives. He would accept that over friendship. It took hours in the driving snow before each of the hostages, over 400 of them, had been escorted through the wall and into the Grey Keep, which had been provisioned and refitted for their stay. Already nearly 500 of Jaehaerys' men stood guard, both as protection and potential executors. No brothers of the Night's Watch were permitted near the holding cells. Jaehaerys was no man's fool, and that many men with grudges against the wildlings as a whole would be a disaster. By the time the procession of children had been marched through and the long line of elders and non-warriors had begun, several of the chieftains had joined Mance and Jaehaerys, among them Tormund Giantsbane and Harma Dogshead. Still no words were spoken, Mance clearly intending to be the last of his people to pass through the wall. Jaehaerys refused to leave for the warmth of the camps on the other side until Mance did the same, even after his uncle had gone to help organize the other side of the wall, so true nightfall found him still standing on the northern side of the 700 feet of ice. The commotion didn't reach them for a while. It started as a low rumble, barely noticeable over the constant stomp of feet as the processions continued through the tunnel. It grew in cacophony steadily, however, and Jaehaerys felt the first true tendril of concern when Ghost rose from a lying position, his hackles on edge, growling deeply. Mance Raider spoke first, his voice cracking from a lack of use that day. Something isn't right. The Thens or Sixskins, rumbled Tormund, staring into the flow of wildling people as it went. I'm surprised they haven't made their move yet. Mance shook his head slowly. No, something else. His eyes suddenly shot wide open, and without preamble he started at a full sprint back towards the wildling camps. He shouted over his shoulder, already drawing his weapons. Protect my son, Tormund. The shouts of alarm reached their ears then, growing in racket until it was overwhelming, the orderly procession of wildlings suddenly a stampede. Jaehaerys barely registered Sir Boren, and several of his knights forming a ring around him and the scribes before they were roughly crushed against him. The lot of them swarmed with desperate people trying to squeeze through a tunnel. The dead, walkers, the demons are upon us. Through the gate now. Jaehaerys fought against the crowd, the white of Sir Boren's cloak crushed against his chest, the silver of Aemon's hair contrasting against the black of Samwell Tarly's. He heard the screams of dying as the slow were trampled by the quick, heard the sound of butchery as the more ruthless drew their weapons and set upon their kin, trying to chop their way through the logjam of the tunnel. It was sudden and complete chaos, and Jaehaerys could only focus on keeping his feet under him as he was helplessly jostled by the crowd. A hand appeared out of the crowd, reaching between Sir Boren and one of the knights to clutch Jaehaerys by the collar of his cloak, jerking him forward with impressive strength. Tormund Giantsbane's face was suddenly in the prince's, eyes as wild as his beard. The boy, roared Tormund Giantsbane. Where on the other side is the boy and Dalla? Where are my daughters? Sir Boren was trying to pry Tormund's hand loose, but the press of the crowd, growing heavier and heavier as hundreds and thousands rushed towards their only hope of salvation, prevented him from utilizing any leverage. And the wilding chief's grip remained firm. Jaehaerys saw no option but to answer. The Grey Keep on the left. Tormund released him, but Jaehaerys wiggled a hand free enough to grab his thick wrist. I'm the only one who can get them free. Tormund glared for a moment, then pulled his hands free, clutched another man's shoulders and bowled him out of the way. He didn't know how long it took or how it was even possible, but Jaehaerys, Aemon and Samwell tucked themselves in behind the big free folk. And inch by inch they fought their way through. Jaehaerys stepped over more than a dozen corpses, most of them unrecognizable as anything human, the tunnel stinking of blood and piss and shit. The 3 sets of great iron gates on the insides were the roughest, but through strength of will the wildling chief fought his way through him, Jaehaerys assisting more than once. There was no honor in it, but Jaehaerys knew he would do no one any good trampled into the snow. And there was positively no chance of going back the way they had come. Forward was his only choice, so forward he went. They all nearly fell out of the logjam of the final gate, Jaehaerys pulling in great lungfuls of air. He staggered forward out of the tunnel and into the hard snow of the other side. This side of the wall was as chaotic as the other, barring the mass of panicked wildlings climbing over the bodies of their dead. The sound of steel meeting steel was prevalent. Southerners and Black brothers fought against the sudden onslaught of wildlings, nearly stampeded with the number of free folk. Only a few of the wildlings even bothered to fight back. Many were sprinting south as fast as their legs could carry them, bringing nothing but their weapons and the furs on their backs. Jaehaerys whirled, placing a hand on Aemon's arm to assure himself his gentle cousin was still there. Samwell Tarly was quivering but alive not far behind, face green. He had no idea where Lord Commander Mormont, Sir Boren, or even Ghost was. It was all going so bloody well. The Prince of the Iron Throne began to shout, though part of him knew it would be hopeless. Recapture the tunnel! Man, a reverberating bellow filled the sky loud and clear over the din of battle and screams of terrified free folk running south, despite it clearly originating from the other side of the wall. Jaehaerys froze, knowing instantly exactly what was making the sound. So did nearly everyone present. Judging by how the courtyard, moments ago a beehive of activity, became still as stone, every set of eyes jumping to the wall. Jaehaerys held his breath, too afraid to move anything but his eyes. Those roved over the immense height of the wall looking for any sign of a fault. Long seconds passed, castle black as still as the tunnel had been frantic. Nothing happened. Jaehaerys let out the held breath in a gust of steam into the dark night, the flakes falling thick and fast. He spoke into the sudden silence, voice raised loud. Fighting one another gets us nothing. Organize a defensive line. A great crack filled the air. With a growing horror, Jaehaerys watched as an obvious, undeniable fissure spread through the once though impassable 700 feet of ice. With an erratic, jerky motion it grew, the wall that had stood for thousands of years giving out a great groan. Jaehaerys' body took over for a stunned mind. He shoved Aemon and Samwell, screaming at the top of his lungs. South, south, away from the wall. Run! He sprinted towards the Grey Keep, voice constantly shouting. Run, run, away, away. He reached the Grey Keep as the wall truly began to shatter, small chunks beginning to fall as the network of fissures spread. As he had ordered, the great doors had been locked from the outside, Jaehaerys possessing the only key. The men he had ordered to stand guard were already gone, in a dead sprint south to try and escape the colossal amount of ice that would soon fall, leaving trails of armor and weapons as they shed anything that might slow them down. His fingers found a dexterity they didn't normally possess, the key working the tumblers of the lock, the prince throwing it to the side as the sound of the wall cracking became unbearably loud. He struggled with the massive board serving as a crossbar. It was meant for 2 men, and Jaehaerys struggled for a long moment before a big pair of hands wrenched it out of the way. Tormund, Giantsbane and Jaehaerys were thrown back as the doors flung open from the inside, a scattering of children who had been pressed against it stumbling out into the heavy snowfall in terror. Run, south! Jaehaerys screamed again, gaining his feet. They flew by him like an unleashed arrow, a flood of young kids and teenagers sprinting with the vitality of youth. Some were older than him, some much too young to be in the position he had put them in. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Tormund step into the crowd, deftly sweeping 2 red-haired girls into his arms before he too started the sprint away from the wall. A boom filled the air, then another accompanied by the shriek of splintering wood, and Jaehaerys' new chunks were starting to come down. Yet still he waited, looking for one face. Dalla was towards the back. Her son clutched to her breast. Val was beside them, holding the hands of 2 very small children, their faces terrified. Without a word, Jaehaerys swooped in, pulling a young boy who couldn't have been more than 5 days old into his arms, Val taking the other. Run! The 5 of them sprinted, Jaehaerys acting completely on instinct as they joined the river of terrified people. Black brothers ran alongside knights, alongside free folk, all thought of war lost. The booms grew louder as the wall truly began to crumble, some landing so close as to throw great mists of snow over the running figures. Some portion of the Prince of the Iron Throne's brain made sure he kept pace with Dalla, the wildling queen holding her bawling infant in a death grip, her blonde hair billowing behind them. He felt when the last of the wall crumbled, and he instinctually threw an arm around Dalla and pushed her to the ground. He shielded the woman, her infant and the young boy with his body. though the seven knew there was nothing his frame could do if they hadn't gotten far enough away. He felt Val pressing close on the other side, all of them pressing their heads together as they waited. The crashes went on forever. More and more snow tossed atop them as Mance Raider's child bawled and the two young children sobbed. Jaehaerys thought nothing, said nothing, did nothing. He only huddled with a passel of free folk and waited his death. His ears rang so loudly that for a long moment he wasn't aware that the world was silent. Hesitantly, the Targaryen heir began to uncurl his body from shielding the others, having to shrug off a large amount of the snow and debris that had been thrown over them. He rose fully to his feet in a daze, the wildling boy still clutched to his chest, staggering as he turned to look back the direction he had just sprinted. All Jaehaerys saw was a high mountain of rubble. Chunks of ice spread for hundreds of yards in all direction. The other side was likely the same, for Jaehaerys saw no portion of the wall standing in any direction. Large chunks of what had once been a defense lay close to them, some bigger than Balerion the Black Dread had been, several landing mere yards away from where he had just been crouching. Jaehaerys knew without a doubt that thousands had been crushed, many of his friends and perhaps family among them. It was a miracle of the seven that he and those he had sprinted with weren't among them. But what had just been unleashed on the south was no miracle, nor could it be of the seven. Jaehaerys Targaryen's heart sank into his heels. The wall had fallen. He'd left Winterfell months ago as part of a great host of warriors, going north to save the world. He returned at the head of a ragtag group of starving children running for his life. They'd gravitated to him in ones and twos. Lost in a snowy land they'd only heard about until then. Young adults to toddlers, well-dressed to half-naked, they somehow found their way to the failed prince. Some cried, some stared in shock, and others merely followed. Their parents were either dead or had been north of the wall when it fell, which in Jaehaerys' mind also meant dead. Very few wildlings of fighting shape had made it through the tunnel before it had all gone to hell. They had sent the rest of their children and their elderly first. They too found themselves following the Targaryen prince, crunching through the new snowfall of the King's Road, slogging through the mostly filled trail Aegon and Aelor had left behind. Only one thing had looked up since, and that was when Ghost simply appeared beside him, scaring the toddler in his arms nearly to death. Jaehaerys had no clue how the direwolf had survived the destruction of the wall or the vicious fighting that accompanied it. But he had sank down and hugged the wolf as tight as his frozen arms could. Soldiers, some knights and others men-at-arms, joined as well, though they were few and far between. There was no food. Jaehaerys' stomach pained him terribly, and he heard the hungry whimpers of the children following him like daggers to his soul. Water was of no consequence, snowmelt plentiful, but the lack of food and warmth took its toll, as did the pace Jaehaerys set. He still hadn't seen with his own eyes what had frightened the wildlings so much that they had brought their salvation down atop their own people's heads, but he knew with certainty that he didn't want to see it. They moved at night all night, constantly moving forward despite the cries of exhaustion and grumbling bellies. Jaehaerys didn't know if the ice demons were deterred by daylight or not. The wildling stories put the attacks at night, but none of them seemed sure that they couldn't attack in the day. Still, night just seemed more fitting, be it true or not, so that was when he moved. The Prince of the Iron Throne only gave them respite during the few hours the sun made an appearance, his followers collapsing into great piles, huddled together around the youngest of their number for warmth. He, Val, and a few of those in their teen years tried to scavenge for firewood, but often their searches were fruitless. He would stagger back to his followers and collapse, he and Val bookending around the two toddlers they had saved, Dalla pressing Mance's son to his back. Ghost would hunker down over top the two small children, serving as a living blanket. He would wake just before dusk, rousing those who followed him out of whatever slumber they had managed to find, forcing them to their feet. Each time some of those who had bedded down earlier couldn't be roused, dead from the cold or the lack of food. The elderly, while they had been there, though almost all of them had fallen behind by now, had urged him to burn the bodies, even the youngest. Jaehaerys either never had the materials or refused to spend the time, but he always put an extra urgency in his pace when they began. He didn't know how many he lost during the days they moved south, but Jaehaerys knew the numbers would shatter what was left of his soul. Jaehaerys himself didn't escape unscathed. 3 of his fingers and the thumb of his left hand were black with frostbite, sparing only the pinky, and the Prince of the Iron Throne was enough of a realist to know there was no saving them. He had given his gloves and overcoat to a young child who barely had anything in terms of protection, and while he could keep his sword hand tucked into his breeches, his left hand was either holding the gloves of the small boy whose name Jaehaerys still didn't know or exposed while carrying him. Jaehaerys supposed he should be grateful it wasn't his nose or ears, as several of the children were going to lose those. And of course, dozens of them were dead, stretched back across their path, leaving a trail of bodies from the wall to the stone of Winterfell. Winterfell's gates were barred, and Jaehaerys could feel more than see the guards lining her curtain walls. his skin prickling with the unseen crossbows and longbows aimed at him. One man, his voice echoing from atop the gatehouse, called out a challenge, voice cutting through the cold night air. "Who goes there?" His voice when he found it was rough with neglect and exhaustion. "Prince Jaehaerys Targaryen." The cold wind carried the low grumblings back to his ears, followed shortly by a different man's voice. "All of you," he felt a spark of anger. He had finally found a touch of sanctuary after days and days of leaving dead children behind him. He was in no mood for another delay. "Yes, bloody all of us, now open the damn gates." It took forever in the mind of Jaehaerys, dawn beginning to lighten the sky before the great gates of Winterfell were thrown open. His mother, tears streaming down her face, was the first out of the gates, sprinting through the snow to throw her arms around Jaehaerys and the boy. Lyanna Stark murmured thanks and questions, and while Jaehaerys was thrilled to see her, he spoke only to Roderick Castle, who had led a wary contingent of guards out behind him. "Find them food and clothing. The crown will repay the Starks should any of us survive this winter." Castle hesitated a moment, eyeing the furs. "They're children." His voice this time was sharp as the biting wind. "There used to be more of them. You're going to save these." He looked down at his blackened hand. "Send the Maester to me when he's finished with them and then call a council." A voice he never thought to hear again sounded from beside Castle, and Jaehaerys' eyes shot up to see Eddard Stark striding to the front. "Do as he says." His uncle looked old and defeated. The Prince of the Iron Throne could see more gray and sadness in him than he remembered the grim Lord of the North ever showing before. There is much to be done. Jaehaerys had expected it to hurt when Maester Luwin removed his frostbit fingers, but he hadn't felt a thing. The prince who had lost the wall stared down at the bandages wrapped around his left hand as voices murmured in the great hall of Winterfell. Luwin had informed him even as he worked that, while his ring finger wasn't as far gone as the others, the bite and rot had already set in deeper than any of the Maester's remedies could fix. He removed it as a precaution, to ensure the prince not lose the entire hand. Jaehaerys felt nothing when he looked at it. Not in the physical sense, of course. He could feel the bandage against the flesh that was still living, could feel the pain starting to build where the master had cut the definitive line between what stayed and what didn't. But emotionally he felt nothing for it. It was a hand, he had another, the sword one to boot. He may never be able to fire a bow again, but he could still fight with the blade on his side. What's more, he could still do his everyday task. He could teach himself to cut his own steak, could still write as well as he could before. He would survive. Dozens of children hadn't. When one had seen so many tiny faces frozen to the bitter earth, the loss of a hand seemed trivial. His cousin Aemon sat to one side of him, wrapped up in furs. The brown-haired, violet-eyed Targaryen and Samwell Tarly had been saved by Lord Stark, who had along with some of his men managed to mount horses before the wall fell. He had made a point of freeing as many of the other mounts as he could, and on them many a knight or man-at-arms, or wildling, had made their way to Winterfell, all well ahead of Jaehaerys and his staggering army of children. Robb, however, had not been among those to return. Ned had searched for him, refusing to abandon his eldest son, until the wall itself had begun to collapse. It had taken a concentrated effort of Lords Umber and Glover to convince him to flee then, and they had barely outtraced the falling ice. Lord Eddard blamed himself even if no one else would. It was foolish of him, the fault resided with Jaehaerys alone. Maester Aemon the Targaryen, who had seen so much before and after he had gone blind, was almost certainly dead. Robb and Grey Wind, Harrion Karstark, Sir Boren, Lord Commander Jeor Mormont, Mance Rayder himself, Ygritte. So many hadn't returned. Great Jon Umber had no love for wildlings. His family had been killing them for years, and his uncle Mor's daughter had been abducted by raiders when he was a boy. His opposition to Jaehaerys' plan had been the fiercest, and even now the giant man glared at Val and Tormund. Jaehaerys had learned the bearded wildling, and his daughters had been found by a middle-aged black brother known only as Alman, who had led a mixed party of survivors, among them wildlings, those who were so normally at odds banding together in fear of what was behind them, to Winterfell. Lord Stark had given them all protection, despite the many and frequent protests of those present. The prince had insisted Tormund and Val attend this council as representatives of the free folk. Whoever had brought down the wall and whatever their reasons, they were all in this together now. It was to this too that Great Jon spat his rhetoric. Those fuckers brought the wall down and let the demons among us, and we give them protection. Their way of life is to kill and pillage like rabid fucking dogs. We should be killing them, not feeding them. A roar of approval met them, and Jaehaerys felt Val shift uneasily on his other side. In response he stood, and though the crowd quieted, he saw more angry glares than he did supportive glances. These people were going to change their way of life, Lord Umber. All they wanted was protection. Umber growled deep in his throat. "Oh, I saw your ploy to try and control them, lad. Look where it's gotten us. Jaehaerys met the big man's eyes cleanly. There was no fear left in him. Whoever brought the wall down isn't among us. Thorin Smallwood, the most senior surviving ranger of the Night's Watch that had been found so far, shot to his feet. No, they're dead with most of our friends and soldiers, just as we soon will be. He beseeched the lords around him, face furious. The men at the other towers and castles are likely dead as well. They wouldn't have had any notion of what was going on. The wall is gone and there is nothing to protect us now. My brother has thousands and thousands of men in the south. Lord Alester Faring snorted. They're all busy fighting thousands of other men. Yet Lord Stark has thousands left in the north making their way here now. Smallwood cursed in exasperation. Don't you understand, boy? It doesn't matter. The wall was more than a tall stack of ice. It was interwoven with spells that kept the dead from passing it. Without those, no number of men will stop them from destroying all the north, and then they'll be ripe to take the war-torn south. Jaehaerys grit his teeth. Watch your tongue. Smallwood let loose a maniacal, taunting laugh. Or what? You'll sentence me to take the black. Hoster Tully did that years ago, and I served it loyally until you destroyed the watch and killed his grandson. His uncle Eddard spoke for the first time then, and his voice was as cold as Jaehaerys had ever heard it, cutting Smallwood even smaller. Never speak of my son again. You aren't worthy of uttering his name. Silence descended, the lords of the north hanging their heads until Eddard spoke again. If we can't defend the north, then none of it matters anyway. I will fight until my last breath to protect this land. I'd do it willingly, but in this case there is no other alternative anyway. A voice Jaehaerys never thought to hear in this setting piped up from beside him. Then leave. All eyes jumped to Aemon Targaryen, the slightly built dragonlord who looked more like a shopkeeper than a man of royal blood. Instead of cringing into a small ball as Jaehaerys expected, Aemon returned the gazes, though a red flush creeped along his skin. His normally quiet voice had a steel backbone that Jaehaerys had never heard before, and the prince felt himself take his seat when Aemon stood. Leave the north. A round of scoffs filled the air, Great John Umber's disbelieving voice weaving among them. You can't be fucking serious. Who are you to speak, boy? Aemon raised his chin. I am the son of the dragon of Duskendale, and I am as serious as the threat we face. The north is too broad to defend it all. I still haven't seen it with my own eyes, but the whites are said to come in waves like an ocean tide. They will swallow an army whole. A new voice, belonging to some minor Lord Jaehaerys didn't actually know, filtered in from the back. We still don't know if they truly exist. Tormund Giantsbane, who had sat through the insults to his people with a face of stone, finally spoke. I do, so does every other free folk here, and so do the crows. We've fought them, been killed by them. Do you think anything less than a living night terror would have made Mance Raider and the free folk kneel to twats like you southerners? Do you think anything less than an evil worse than your cuntish rules would have made us give up our children, and then bring our only hope down on top of our own heads? Think what you will about the free folk, but we were willing to do everything we ever swore not to survive this thing you haven't seen. Trust me, you weak-kneed Southron. I've seen enough of it for us both. Aemon didn't let any outrage at the big man's words resonate, speaking almost as soon as Tormund finished. We had a wall to stop them, and whatever the reasons why, now we don't. We can't face them in the open field. How do you fight something that brings winter itself? All those who died at the wall are now in their numbers, and Smallwood is correct in that we don't have enough. So we do the only thing reasonable, we leave. We do as Lord Umber and some of the far northern lords did. We take our families and we leave. A northern lord, Ryswell, if memory served Jaehaerys correctly, chimed in. What, leave all of our homes, our castles and woods? Aemon faced him. Yes, the dead have no need of plunder and loot. All they want is to turn those living into one of their own. Leave everything but your families and all the food you can carry and run south. Lord Serwyn pointed out the obvious. Eventually south runs out, Lord Aemon. Aemon nodded in agreement. Yes, it does, but it will take us and the others months to get south of the neck, where Westeros naturally shrinks to where it is barely a quarter as wide as it is here. The bogs of the neck and mountains cut the strip of passable land even smaller. Build your defensive line there where we can't be flanked. I am young, my lords, and I know nothing with certainty about what we face. But I equate their advance to a tide. Tides follow the path of least resistance, and mountains and bogs are the embodiment of resistance. They will go where we want them, where we can be ready for them, where we can stop them. Lord Stark was watching Aemon intently, face emotionless. There is a war in the south. Yes, Lord Stark, but as I said, it will take months for anything, dead or living, to make it south in these snows. My father will have handled the south by then. His combined with our numbers will be enough, or at the least our best hope of ever having enough. Smallwood risked speaking again. Nothing can stop them, as you said, you don't know this enemy. Aemon's eyes lit with a fire that reminded Jaehaerys of Aelor. And you, sir, don't know my father. Grumbles of debate followed, and Aemon suddenly retook his seat, face red as the Targaryen symbol. Jaehaerys reached his good hand over to squeeze his arm in reassurance. I don't know where any of that came from, cousin, but I am thankful for it. The head table let the debate roll for a long while, until finally Ned Stark, who had been conversing quietly with his wife and Maester Luwin, looked to Jaehaerys. The prince nodded his agreement to the plan, seeing the question in his eyes, and Eddard Stark rose. Young Lord Aemon has the right of it. As Lord Paramount of the North, I order it to be evacuated, immediately. Grumbles of both disagreement and confirmation met him, and he raised a hand. My son is dead. Many of your sons are dead as well. I do not intend to lose the rest of my family. Our homes will still be here when this threat is destroyed. Many of you followed me in the last war. I ask you to follow me in this much different one. The larders of Winterfell will be emptied to feed those who go south. He straightened his shoulders and stood taller. I, along with any volunteers, will remain to hold back this coming wave as long as possible. Catelyn Tully gripped his hand in a panic, and Lord Stark reached the other around to cup her face, smiling gently before he turned back to the crowd. There must always be a Stark in Winterfell. Jaehaerys watched the reactions of those around, from the Lords of the North to the Brothers of the Watch to the two wildlings beside him, before he too stood. I will stand beside Lord Stark. He heard his mother's gasp, even as Great John Umber pointed out the obvious. You have half a hand, so I'll tie my shield to my arm instead. He cleared his throat. I was tasked with holding the wall. I did what I thought was best, what I still think was best, but I ultimately failed. Many died because of that failure. I saw dozens of children freeze or starve to death because of the panic and terror our enemy brings. I will stay here to fight that enemy. He looked to his uncle. Besides, I am half wolf, and wolves run in a pack. Begin the preparations at once. Send riders and ravens to the other lords and those south. We evacuate the north. Aelor Targaryen stared at the opening line of the letter in disbelief. It fell. The bloody thing is 700 feet tall and leagues wide. What knocked it down? An aggressive wind. King Aegon Targaryen, the sixth of his name, was seated at the head of the long table in his tent, head in his hands. Snow was falling outside. Snow was always falling outside, and the lantern beside him was the only source of light. His nephew had aged in the months they'd spent trapped in the north. He had lost nearly a stone of weight that wasn't there to be lost in the first place, and his face was harder than it had been on the onset of the campaign. Keep reading. Jaehaerys mentioned something of a magic horn. Aelor collapsed into the seat at his right hand. Taking the wineglass Dickon Tarly instantly offered him. The vintage tasted particularly good after the weeks he'd spent trapped in the north without any, their supply an early casualty of the weeks spent digging. A magic horn, a fucking magic horn, brought down a structure that has stood for millennia. Aegon gestured towards the letter with one hand, forehead still resting in the other, his eyes closed tightly. Aelor imagined the king already had the headache Aelor himself felt coming on. So Jaehaerys says, and I see no reason why he should lie to us. Dickon, rouse the council. This changes everything. The squire rushed to obey, leaving the two Targaryen commanders alone for a few minutes, aside from Sir Balon Swan standing guard outside the tent. Aelor quickly read the rest of the letter, feeling both immense relief when he read his son Aemon was among the living and immense grief when he read that his son's namesake wasn't. That grief was compounded when Robb Stark was listed among the missing. Jaehaerys' words were short and to the point, and their abrupt delivery as much as their content caught the hand of the king unawares. He allowed them through. Aegon finally removed his head from his hands, slouching back into his chair and finishing his own glass of wine in 3 long gulps. My dear brother was convinced that the wildlings weren't a true threat. I imagine he saw his actions as protecting them, though he never says it outright. Whatever his reasons. The wall came down on top of both the free folk and our own men. While no one knows the exact number of casualties, all agree they are tremendous. What's more, Aelor had been reading the letter as well as listening to the king's word, and they arrived on the same topic at the same time. He's evacuating the north, all of it, and he alongside Lord Stark are remaining in Winterfell to try and stem the tide. He's going to get himself killed. Aelor let the letter fall to the table, staring down at it in disbelieving thought. So we have an entire region, from the small folk to the Lord Paramount's family, descending on our heads, accompanied by a passel of wildlings and their children and a horde of ice demons behind them. They'll all need places to sleep and food to eat, the living ones anyway. Aegon nodded, reaching across the table to take his uncle's untouched wineglass and knocking back another hefty gulp from it. They are stripping the castles and towns of the north of food as they come, but yes, that is our predicament. All the while Viserys advances on us. Another voice came from the mouth of the tent, Alaric Langward, the first member of the War Council to enter. Aye, and he has the advantage in cavalry. I finished the count of living mounts we have left, including those of Lord Arryn's men. Aelor looked to his former squire and old friend, grasping onto talk of real numbers and logistics instead of ice demons and falling walls. While Aelor had believed there truly was something on the other side of the wall, he had never expected it to chase the living out of the north. And Alaric took a seat beside Aelor, running a hand through his shaggy black hair. He too had lost weight, though he had even less to begin with than Aegon. Over half of our mounts went down before we dug our way out, and most of the rest are still coming back from the brink of death. Only the fiercest of our beasts still have their strength to them. I make it 800 mounted if we count the half-dead ones, less than 3 if we don't. Lord Arryn brings an additional 1,000, but reports put Viserys at twice again our number, more if you count the reputed elephants. Aelor and Aegon cursed at the same time. Both slamming a fist against the table, the king spoke. The snows aren't nearly as bad down here as they were in the north, but they certainly aren't light either, and it is getting colder every day. We're bound to lose a few more before we engage the enemy. Aelor grunted. Even when we do, none of us have any experience fighting elephants. Most of us have never seen elephants. If Viserys is smart, he'll charge them at the levee lines. They'll throw down their spears and run as if the stranger himself was pursuing them. Jon Arryn, aging but still capable, entered the tent. He and 10,000 men split from the defense of the Riverlands had been waiting at the Twins, uniting with Aelor and Aegon not quite a week past. Behind him walked his son Ardes, heir to the Vale, rubbing the sleep from his tully blue eyes. The boy and his twin sister were not identical but still looked much alike, Aelor remembered, save for her hair being red and Ardes the color of corn silk. His father spoke as the two Arryns took their seats. I take it things have changed, your grace. By your faces I wager it was for the worst. They waited until the entire council had assembled. Randall Tarley was present as chief general, Lord William Dustin and Sir Wylies Manderly as representatives of the 5,000 Northerners camped around them. Renler and Balin, the first half awake and the second looking as if it were the middle of the day instead of the darkest hours of night, were present due to their Targaryen blood, though both were expected to keep their silence. Sir Carol Vance, whose daughter and heir Lion was being held captive by Viserys, had been the only Riverlord to accompany Jon Arryn, the others focused on defending their homeland and was representing his region. 3 of the Kingsguard, Barristan the Bold, Oswell Went and Balon Swan rounded out the council. Arthur Dane and Roland Storm, the only other surviving members of the Kingsguard now that Boren of the Bramsfort was considered dead, were with Alysanne, Daenerys and the others in the Vale, though a raven had been sent to recall them both to their king's side. While neither Aelor nor Aegon wanted to leave the royal family without one of the sworn swords, it was agreed that they would both be needed in the coming battles more than they would be in the near impregnable Eyrie or Gates of the Moon. The detachment of 20 knights that accompanied Sir Arthur south months ago would remain to supplement the Arryn men as protection. Aegon repeated the news in Yehary's letter bluntly and nearly verbatim, and Aelor watched the shock and disbelief as it dawned on each of their faces. Carol Vance gave voice to the thought the rest of them almost certainly were thinking. You can't be serious. Aegon met his eyes and held them to prove his sincerity, though neither Targaryen kingpin could blame the disbelief. They had, of course, warred with it themselves. I wish I wasn't, Sir Carol, but my brother's leader was accompanied by confirmation from Lord Eddard Stark. Whatever the why or the how, the wall has fallen, and a much greater enemy than my uncle Viserys is marching towards us. I don't ask your acceptance of this as truth, my lords. I fully understand your disbelief, but I do ask what you would counsel me to do if you did. Aelor had stood and walked to the northern half of the map, taking the pieces symbolizing their armies there and sliding them all into a line on the Kingsroad south of Winterfell. The armies we left in the north, including the Northerners who had been on watch for the Ironborn, are now all coming this way. That being said, these pieces are a gross misinterpretation of our true strength in fighting men. We don't know just how many of our forces were killed when the wall fell, but it is safest to assume a catastrophic number. He motioned towards the Riverlands and the pieces, black for friendly and red for foe, scattered across its coast. Lord Stannis has defeated 2 large Ironborn fleets, and that has put the rest of them on the defensive. From all reports, the raiders have ceased their raiding for the time being, massing their strength to try and counter our own fleets. While that in theory frees up enough men to astronomically outnumber Viserys, it in reality does little for us. The forces under Lord Tully, Tyrion Lannister and Jason Mallister have gone on the offensive, trying to drive the Ironborn out of the many holdings they have secured in the Riverlands and Westerlands. The armies of the Reach are doing the same, and even if they weren't, they are much too far away to assist us with Viserys. Finally, Aelor gestured to the cluster of black pieces around Wycombe where they currently sat, and the cluster of red around Maidenpool, where Viserys had last been seen. The latter information was shaky, however. The Outriders of the Golden Company were good, and had managed to eliminate any scouts sent to keep further tabs for the last week and a half. It had prompted Aelor to send Bronn and his best retainers out. I could use Lucas Flowers, but odds are he's dead now. We cannot leave Viserys free to roam south of us. Prince Jaehaerys' plan is to set up defensive lines at the neck. It is sound and our best chance should the worst of the rumors be true. But Viserys doesn't have the knowledge of the goings-on in the north, and even if he did, his focus is entirely on eliminating us. We draw him into battle or he draws us. Either way, he must be dealt with. A unified Westeros will be needed for the wars to come, and a unified Westeros can never be attained if two Targaryens are calling themselves king. Aegon gestured towards the city of his birth. King's Landing, which has been the Golden Company's only true victory thus far, is of no further consequence. Viserys willingly conceded it to Prince Oberyn when he set out after us. The Dornish reported they are already moving out of the Boneway to retake it from the token force left behind. Viserys must mean to engage us soon. His only hope of achieving victory now would be the death of me and Aelor, and all of Aelor's sons to boot. Randall Tarly nodded, eyes absorbing the map and its pieces. Aye, your grace, the archers and cavalry that slowed Lord Arryn's march to join us have disappeared, likely to regroup with his main force. Whether Viserys learned enough strategy to see it or not, the Golden Company commanders certainly understand they can't let the other armies merge with our own. They need to remove the heads of the true Targaryen rulers before their substitute can reign. Aegon sighed loudly. And now I have to worry about an army of undead demons coming from the other direction. Trenches must be built, fire pits. I can't well focus on that enemy while Viserys roams the south. As my uncle said, he must be brought to heel before I can focus on the others, yet I cannot ignore the preparations that must be made in the north. Jon Arryn was focusing on the figures representing the other loyalist forces on the shores of the Riverlands, focused mainly around Cannet and Eagle's Cape. I understand the desire of the Riverlords to recapture their homeland, and how Lord Tyrion must wish to push down into the embattled Westerlands, but now that the imminent threat of more Reavers furthering their conquests is over, they must realize the Ironborn hold is temporary. We are outnumbered, slightly, but still outnumbered by Viserys. Their men will be of more use fighting alongside us, both in destroying Viserys and countering whatever it is coming towards us from the north, before we can all focus on destroying the rest of the Ironborn. When we split up originally, it was because the Reavers were still terrorizing new targets. Now their threat is occupied. Sir Carol shook his head. I understand your point, Lord Arryn, and it is accurate. But our people are suffering atrocities under the Ironborn, and few men, myself included, will be able to see past that. I am here because my daughter is held captive in King's Landing, or she was in any case. My stake is in the instant defeat of Viserys and the safe return of Lion. The other Riverlords have their stakes in the defeat of the Ironborn, and relieving their families and people who have been fighting or suffering for months. They will not care for rumors of demons in the north, even if they should. King Aegon nodded slowly, though his face was a grimace. I was trapped in the North Hole, my people were slaughtered. I can understand why they may see me as unable to defend them now. Lord Commander Barristan the Bold cut the king's self-censure short. You are the king, your grace. If you order Lords Edmure and Tyrion to your side, they are duty-bound to come. I don't foresee them shirking that duty. Aegon stared at the table for a long while before speaking again. Viserys has me outnumbered. Slightly, but outnumbered all the same. His men are in better condition than mine, as are his horses. His army consists of a corps of hardened mercenaries and a plethora of young lords with vendettas against me. Against me, you mean? I'm the reason the Bucklers and Paynes and Hasties have risen up. Aelor thought it but didn't say it, as every man at the table already knew anyway. The king spoke on, oblivious to his uncle's thoughts. Even if Viserys is the one to assault me, wherever it is we meet in battle, he holds an advantage. I need Lord Edmure here if I am to be victorious. Alaric gestured towards the wide expanse of land between their current location and the rest of Lord Edmure's forces. If I may point out, your grace, it would take many days for their infantry to reach us. Viserys has tipped his hand. He means to try and eliminate you soon, and while we can't confirm it, we all know his army is near. And that still does not resolve the main question of this council. What do we do in the north? The dragon of Duskendale grunted as it suddenly dawned on him. It should be clear to us all, we faced it for several cold months. We ignore it. Aegon cocked a brow. Ignore Jaehaerys' letter, ignore those coming south for safety. Aelor nodded, violet eyes locked on his nephews. Yes, what is the entire reason we are so depleted both in spirit and horseflesh? Because it took us months to make it south in those snows. It will take those fleeing now weeks as well. as the snows are only growing. They'll have something of our trail to follow, but the progress will still be slow as the storms have only increased in ferocity. I don't know what a white truly is or what powers it, but I imagine it still has to move something like a man does. It will take them time as well to walk or claw or burrow to us. We're looking at this as if the others are on our doorstep, when in reality they are months away. Aegon had pursed his lips in thought. There are still trenches to be dug, traps to be set. Lord Tarly and I built dozens of catapults and dug scores of siege lines in a matter of a few days at Casterly Rock and Lannisport. We had thousands of men to do it. When the time comes, so will you. Viserys is the threat, your grace. He is the one we need to eliminate first, not the White Walkers, not the Ironborn. Viserys. Murmurs of agreement filled the tent and Aegon slowly nodded. You are right, Uncle, Balin. Order both ravens and riders sent to Lords Edmure and Tyrion. They are march with all haste to join us at Harrenhal if we can get there. We will keep on our toes and Viserys at an arm's length as long as we can, but they are to move as quickly as possible. We can only forgo combat so long. Send another to the Dornish. Once Prince Oberyn recaptures King's Landing, he is only to leave just enough men to manage it in my stead before he marches towards us as well. The Reach will take over the cleansing of the Ironborn. They will work from their own lands north and join us at the neck if they can make it in time. Quickly now. Jon Arryn looked to the king. Do you think Lord Edmure will make it before Viserys draws us in? Lord Willys, nearly as round as his father had been but fierce of spirit, spoke up for the first time, fiddling with the silver and sapphire trident holding his sizable cloak together. Order his cavalry to leave the infantry behind, your grace. A fully mounted force will reach us much quicker, and even the odds against us by quite a bit. Randyll Tarly and Aelor both grunted their approval, though the former spoke first. Yes, your grace, your uncle led cavalry the long way into the Westerlands while I led the infantry the short all those years ago. He still nearly beat me there. Aegon gestured towards Renler, who had woken up considerably over the talk of strategy. Go catch Balin and make the adjustments, Ren. Aegon leaned back towards the map as his cousin strode from the tent. Now all we need to do is find out just where Viserys is waiting. An accented voice answered from the front of the tent, snow-covered cloak glistening as he stepped into the light of the tent. I believe I can help with that. Bronn dropped a leather saddlebag onto the table. I pulled some letters off of a few dead ravens and a few living men. Though they joined the ravens soon after. After reading them, I went to take a look-see myself. Turns out they were right. Bronn had a knack for the dramatic, but Aelor was too tired to sate the man's need for a scene. Just tell us, Bronn. The sellsword shrugged. You're no fun. Our king wannabe is only a few days south of us near Lord Haraday's town or Barovay's town, some name such as that. Aegon filled in the gap, face already starting to grimace at the proximity of Viserys. Lord Haraway's town. Aye, that one. Lots of tents, lots of horses. Lots of fires, he's got a bloody big force. According to these, he said, thumping the dripping sack, he's heading our way. Turns out he has a destination already in mind. Bronn looked directly at Aelor. A ford filled with rubies. This was to be his day of glory. King Viserys Targaryen was losing the war. He had taken and held King's Landing for over half a year, and he held a numerical advantage over his foe. But any man with half a mind could see that the odds were stacking heavier and heavier against him. This sense of defeat was doubly frustrating considering he himself had yet to so much as draw his blade in any true battle. The Ironborn had failed him, nearly half of the Greyjoy family dead. Meryn Greyjoy, who Viserys supposed was their new king though his understanding of Ironborn succession laws had always been hazy, was trying a last-ditch effort to defeat Stannis Baratheon, but the king of the Iron Throne was no fool. If 2 fleets of Ironborn hadn't been able to defeat the Iron Stag, he highly doubted a third would fare any better. His brother and nephew had managed to merge with friendly forces despite Maelo Jane's attempts. Fewer lords had sworn for him than he had anticipated. The cold had increased in the last several weeks until it was nearly unbearable. Miachella had escaped those months ago, as had Alysanne and her spawn. King's Landing was destined to fall to the Dornish moving up from the south and likely already had. He still didn't have Daenerys. Yes, Viserys was losing the war. But today, with one decisive battle, he was going to turn that tide. Today he was going to become the uncontested king of the Iron Throne in the most complete of methods. He was going to kill all other claimants ahead of him. He peered across the ice-skimmed shallows of the Trident to the army forming on the opposite bank. He had been here, waiting for them for over a week. His scouts reporting they had remained encamped a few days north for nearly as long. Viserys had been concerned that his brother and nephew wouldn't take Viserys up on the poetic justice of a second battle of the Trident. Aegon's reign had begun here, why not see if it would end here as well? Still, the army of his kinsmen had remained where they were long after they had surely learned of Viserys' location. But in the end, Viserys' knowledge of his brother had won out. Aelor, though he would never admit it, had a weakness for interweaving sentimental and physical points into the same blow. He had, after all, played the reins of Castamere minutes before destroying Lannisport and every day of the siege of Casterly Rock. The temptation of returning here to solve the fate of the Iron Throne, here where his greatest victory had been achieved, would have been too much to pass up. And so Aegon was here at the center of the armies marching towards him. Aelor was here as well. Viserys had seen the warring white dragons and the ragtag band of heavily armed killers that formed his retinue. His two most important sons were likely here as well, leaving only the boy demon and the bookish, weak Aemon. His daughters made no difference, as none in Westeros would choose a female over a healthy living male as ruler, and the two other nephews could easily be dealt with at a later date, once the lords swore for him upon the death of their two true leaders. Viserys supposed there was a chance the child Miachella had been carrying had been a boy and could conceivably be considered higher in the succession, but Viserys felt no fear of an infant. He wasn't nearly as good an uncle as Aelor had been. He'd already killed a niece. What difference would adding a nephew to the list be? Besides, God's willing, it would be the fourth nephew he dispatched, following the three here today. That left only Jaehaerys. And from what Viserys was hearing from the north, that nephew was either already dead or soon would be. His Kingsguard sat their horses around him, silent and waiting. He still only had 4 members, leaving the rest open for men who were currently opposing him. It was a unifying technique, one used by Aelor when he had appointed Roland Storm at the end of the rebellion. He supposed there would have been wisdom to have a full complement before this penultimate battle. But Viserys had opted against it. As he looked across the banks and water, he wondered if it was his worst mistake yet. The army facing him didn't look like the ragtag band of half-starved men the scouts had told him to expect, even if he accounted for the fresh men of the Arryns. The months it had taken them to dig their way out of the north should have left them in a state of disarray, animals starved and men suffering. Instead, they looked like an army of grizzled professionals. As intimidating as the Golden Company that surrounded Viserys, there were also different banners than the ones he had been expecting, belonging to more houses than the ones that had reportedly went north with Aegon. The Trout of Tully could be seen, as well as the standards of lesser riverlords. Most of them flew above what appeared to be cavalry, though there was still enough distance between the two forces that it was difficult to pick out exactly where one of Aegon's formations ended and another began. His nephew wasn't as weak as Viserys would have wanted, but the Golden Dragon wouldn't be deterred. This was where he would win his crown, just as Aelor had won Aegon's nearly 20 years ago. He spoke to the officers around him. You all know the plan. Renly Baratheon and his band of dissenting lords would form the right, Viserys in command of the center with the assistance of Duncan Strong and Maelo Jane the left. Black Balak and his archers were the reserve, ready to counter any attack with a barrage of arrows from their great bows. Harry Strickland was in command of the elephants, the secret weapon that Viserys supposed wasn't so secret. He was answered with a round of affirmatives in your graces. Excellent, Sir Loras, you are in command of the charge, do not disappoint me. I won't, your grace. The Knight of Flowers was dressed in his boisterously expensive armor, adorned with jeweled flowers from helm to plated boots. He had forgone his signature cape of woven roses. He'd have been hard-pressed to find a single flower in these snows, much less enough to weave out an entire cape. Still, Viserys wondered if he realized this was a war, not one of the tourneys the young Tyrell was so used to dominating. That wonder had nearly made Viserys appoint another, more experienced commander. But the Knight of Flowers was an excellent fighter and rider even if his mindset was wrong. He would look splendid heading the charge atop his white destrier, and his skill for swordplay would be needed. Good, all of you to your places. His commanders reined their animals around, kicking them into gallops that threw droves of snow into the air. Sir Duncan, the father of Viserys' very young Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, instantly trotted to his side. The Golden Company sergeant was in direct command of the lines in the center, while Viserys would remain a stone's throw back to oversee the entire operation. Until it is time, and then I will personally claim my crown. Take command of the center and wait until my order. Yes, your grace. The sergeant paused only a moment to clasp wrists with his white-cloaked son before he rode towards the lines of men, levy and mercenary, silently awaiting the bloodshed to come. Viserys watched as Aegon's army marched the rest of the way towards their bank, spears ready to drop into position. The wind picked up slightly, the flakes blowing in at an angle. Viserys let his eyes rove the lines of enemy forces, searching until his eyes found him. A man in scarred black armor sat a massive destrier towards the back of the enemy lines, his helm adorned with white flames, and he was staring right at Viserys. He'd stared across this same ford a lifetime ago, though then it had been from the opposite bank. It was here nearly every friend the dragon of Duskendale had died. It was here his elder brother, the Silver Prince the poet, had fallen lifeless into the water. It was here where the man who slew him had in turn been slain, 2 kings dead within the span of a few minutes as the blood of thousands turned the water red. It was here Aelor Targaryen once again gazed across a ford at an opposing army, his king and blood by his side. This time the water was icy and the world was white with snow, with more pouring out of the sky. But Aelor Targaryen could still see the corpses stacked high in his mind's eye. He could point out exactly where Rhaegar had fallen with his rubies glittering in the bloody water, could see the spot where Robert Baratheon had followed him into death, could still see Renfred Ricker half submerged with a sword under his ribs and a lance in his shoulder. This ford held many memories for him, each more terrible than the last. It was fitting he would come here to die. Nearly 20 years have passed, yet I can still see it as vividly as if it had happened only this morning. A voice answered from his left, Alaric reining a stallion, one of the few truly healthy ones, to a halt beside him. "Aye, your grace." The lord of the Brindlewood pointed to a spot on their side of the bank where a line of men-at-arms were adding to the shield wall. "There is where you fell off your horse." The dragon of Duskendale couldn't help but smirk. "Aye, and where you didn't let me die." The smirk died as he in turn gestured towards the middle of the ford where in minutes bodies would once again clog the waters. "And that is where Rhaegar did. I never visited this ford. You'd think I would have, since here is where my father died and my reign began." King Aegon Targaryen, the 6th of his name, sat a destrier as regally as Rhaegar ever had. He was dressed in the expensive, quality armor he had so wanted to test. Thick black plate rippled with streaks of crimson, his helm adorned with 7 red gold points to signify the similar crown the king wore in times of peace. Behind him Dickon Tarly held the Targaryen banner, crimson dragon flapping in the wind. Across the ford a golden one did the same. It seems the entire world is poetic these days. The first Targaryen civil war had the greens and the blacks. This one has the reds and the golds. The bards will love it. His eyes found Viserys despite the forest of spears and helms in the way. He was sitting his saddle in the very same position Aelor and Rhaegar once had, watching across the ford. Golden wings sprouted from a helm of black steel, gaudy and expensive. White cloaks surrounded him, mounted on fresh horses, their great lungs billowing clouds of steam into the snow-filled air. "Hello, brother, I've come to kill you." Renler. Balin, his 2 sons who had been sitting their stallions to the right and back of the king in his hand, responded, Ren with a father and Balin with a grunt. "You will fight alongside the king today." Aegon turned to cast a questioning eye on his uncle, and Aelor knew both his sons were doing the same. Ren spoke for all 3. "But father, our place is with you." The dragon of Duskendale's voice didn't possess the harsh tone his words could have held, his voice instead low and calm. "Your place is where I deem it. Today I deem it alongside the king." The king in question spoke, voice unchallenging. "Balin is your squire. He is also my son. I can live without the former but not the latter. If they ride beside me into the hell I'll be charging into, I'm likely to get your entire army killed. I want them with you. Fighting will be rough here as well." Aelor nodded, eyes never having left the spot where he had locked gazes with Viserys, though a banner with the 3 buckles of buckler had since blocked his gaze. "Aye, that it will, but my charges have a tendency to be suicidal." He finally looked to Aegon. "Your mother would never forgive me if I let any of you join me." His king gave no further argument, merely tilting his head in deference. The lines had finished forming. Randall Tarly in command of the left and Jon are in the right. An eerie silence had descended as the men on both sides held their breath, 2 armies waiting for one or the other to land the first blow in a vicious brawl. A call to knock from across the river broke through it, instantly followed by a cry for shields on their own. Their mercenary bows outrange our own by dozens of yards, but we were ready for that. "Father, mother, any of you who will listen. Please protect my sons." Out loud Aelor spoke simple words, not feverish prayers. "It seems we are about to begin." He clasped Aegon's wrist, then shifted his horse to do the same with Renler and Balin. For just a moment he gave into the emotion welling in his chest at the sight of them. Never has a man been blessed with such wonderful sons. He glanced at Aegon then to make sure the king knew he was including him in the statement. "I love you all more than you'll ever know." With a half-roar from his stallion, the dragon of Duskendale turned and cantered towards his command. Loose. Hundreds of bowstrings twanged, sending hundreds of arrows into the falling snow. Cries of shields, and duck sounded from the other bank, and there was an odd few seconds before those shouts of warning became screams of dying men. The shrill cry of a struck horse filled the sky, and Viserys shudder at its blood-curdling sound. He'd heard it before at the tourney at Bitterbridge, when a hedge knight had struck a dishonorable blow on a Reachman lordling's horse. It had been terrible then, and it was still terrible now. He knew he would hear it time and time again in the coming hours. Before the screams elicited from the first volley had even fully started, the Golden Company archers had drawn and fired again. Black Balak and his men were quick and accurate, torrents of arrows falling on the heads of the loyalist forces. Viserys let them fire 5, 10, 15 volleys, half expecting some kind of response from Aegon. He got none. His nephew's lines remaining in position, shields over their heads as they grimly waited out the storm of sharpened steel and snowflakes. Ah well, we figured that may be the case. He spoke to banner-bearer slightly behind him. Now, the banner dipped twice to signal Sir Loras, who had clearly been chomping at the bit. The Knight of Flowers instantly kicked his men into action, thousands of mounted knights and freeriders thundering away from Viserys' own lines towards the enemy, their guttural war cries filling the air. The Golden Dragon watched their progress, watched as Aegon's own archers opened fire. Dozens of his knights and lancers spilled from their saddles, and dozens more horses added their dying screams into the cacophony of battle. They had charged towards the frozen shallows of a river, the water covered in a thin coat of ice and thicker coat of snow. It had been clean and pure when Tyrell began his charge. He left an ugly mess of broken ice and broken bodies in his wake. Viserys didn't know how many of his men died crossing the icy water, but it made no difference. They smashed into Aegon's forces like an armored fist, as Aelor had smashed into Robert Baratheon years earlier. Just as they had then, the sides of the defending lines swooped in on the intruding horsemen. Viserys saw his nephew's royal banner in the middle of it all, the former king of the Iron Throne amidst the carnage that Bank was certain to be. His brother's banner of white warring dragons was near it, and while Viserys hadn't seen his uncle in the beehive of bodies across the water, he was certain he was there, killing alongside his king. "Our left, your grace, they are weakest on the left." Viserys allowed his eyes to follow Ormond Cole's pointing finger, focusing on the left of the Crimson Dragon's lines. While it was hard to distinguish where one force began and another ended, the opposite bank looking like a northern melee of steel and snow, the far left of Aegon's force was visibly weaker than the right or center. There were banners of knights and houses on that side, same as everywhere, but they were fewer, denoting a larger force of levies. It was sensible of Aegon. The terrain on that flank was naturally steeper than the center or right, and his scouts had certainly reported it. It was not much of a difference, but enough of one to ensure men and horses would have a more difficult time climbing it. Aegon and his advisors had placed their strongest troops where they would most be needed. It was sensible. It was also a mistake, the type of mistake Golden Company had been hoping for. Viserys took it. "Signal Lord Strickland. Focus on the left now before they can reinforce it." His signalman waved the banner again, and Viserys felt the rumble as the elephants burst from their cover in the trees. They made an even more glorious sight than Loras Tyrell had. Their great gray hides covered in armor, saddles on their backs home to several archers and crossbowmen. Their ivory tusks were sharpened at the end, ready to impale and knock aside their foe. They would fold Aegon's left in on itself, and Viserys chose that moment to take command. He kicked his destrier into action. "I will lead the infantry." Alester Strong hesitated, though the other Kingsguard began to follow. "This is close enough, your grace." Viserys spared only a moment to glare at him. "It isn't close enough for Aelor." He galloped on, ignoring his lord commander, his infantry parting to let him pass as he came through their lines. He drew his sword, his Kingsguard doing the same, and thrust it above his head, kicking his stallion into a sprint at the heels of the elephants. His infantry, following the stiff commands of their officers, followed, shouting their own war cries. And Viserys Targaryen rode forth to claim his crown. The Dragon of Duskendale had never in his life been so close to a real battle without participating in it, and it was driving him insane. Warrior roared and pawed, clearly as unhappy as his master at being so far from the action. Behind him, lines of mounted knights and freeriders silently sat their mounts, the best animals Aegon's forces had left. Their numbers were bolstered by half of Edmure Tully's mounted men, but Aelor hadn't dared take all of them. Aegon had to have some mounted force to make Viserys play his hand first. Those men had been in the center around Aegon, and the Dragon of Duskendale had watched as they had countered the Golden Company's first charge, every nerve in his body screaming for him to be there alongside them. His sons were wrapped up in that bloody melee, and Aelor had no way of knowing if they were alive or dead. "I should have kept Ren and Balin with me," he muttered under his breath. "Gods, what was I thinking?" Alaric answered from beside him, hand lightly tracing the grains of wood in the shaft of the boar spear he held. "You were thinking our job is going to be much more dangerous than theirs. You were right. Aelor craned his neck to stare at his old friend, the Lord of Brindlewood, in a set of dark armor with the stars of his house etched all over the breastplate. Worse than that, Alaric looked at him, visor still up to show his calm face. "You know it will be." He did, but it was hard to imagine it now. Each of his knights was armed not with lances but instead boar spears, one in both their right and left hands, their shields strapped to their forearms. The thick shafts and reinforced spearheads were meant for piercing the thick hide of wild boars, not elephants, but they would do better than normal spears or lances. They were heavy and cumbersome. But behind the weight of charging destriers they stood an excellent chance of doing real damage. If it turns out they didn't, the battle would be lost anyway. The elephants were the key factor for both sides. It would be difficult for Aegon to defeat Viserys' army in conventional Westerosi battle, but it would be impossible if the elephants were not dealt with quickly. No one on the continent, aside from a few former sellswords in Aelor's retinue, had any experiences fighting the beasts, and most hadn't even seen one. The archers had been ordered to forgo all other targets and focus solely on the creatures when they entered the battlefield, aiming for their eyes and throats if possible. But Aelor and Aegon had agreed that likely wouldn't be enough. Instead, the dragon of Duskendale sat still as men fought and died hundreds of yards away, concealed by the same trees Oberyn Martell had once flanked Robert Baratheon from. The seven I could use Oberyn now. He and his knights waited for the Golden Company to unleash their trump card, unmoving as more and more men died. When they came barreling out of cover on the far bank, Aelor was too relieved they had finally appeared to be scared. "Ready," he called to his men, lowering his helm with white crests over his head. The white dragon felt the ripple of excitement and heard the clank of steel as they prepared behind him, felt the loved rush of battle fill his veins. "They're focusing on the left as you hoped." Bronn wore minimal armor, striking an odd figure beside the steel-encased men beside him, but Aelor hadn't sent him away. The sellsword looked in his element, gripping the boar spear almost lovingly. "I've never fought elephants before, it should be one hell of a fucking experience." Aelor made no response to the sellsword, instead bellowing at the top of his lungs to the men behind him. "Forward!" With a roar of impatience, warrior exploded out of the trees, the old stallion nearly outrunning the younger beasts beside him in his mad dash to reach the battle. Aelor heard the war cry of his men behind, added his own voice to it even as he saw Viserys' infantry following close behind the elephants. "This is where I belong. This is what I was born for." Lord Arryn had been ordered to pull his men out if the Golden Company took the bait, reforming them behind Aelor's desperate charge, and plugging the gaps the deaths he incurred would leave. The Lord Paramount of the Vale was a capable man, but his job had been nearly impossible. Of the men fleeing from the elephants, very few looked ready to rejoin the battle, most of them peasant levies who had thrown their weapons aside and were fleeing as if the stranger himself was behind them. "It doesn't matter. Bring the beasts down." The world grew silent, the screams of the dying and war cries of the living fading away as Aelor stared through his visor at his target. The lead elephant rumbling towards the sudden hole in loyalist lines. Rhaegar crossed his mind, as did Renfred Ricker and Elwood Hart. All of those who had died fighting for him, some on this very bank and others on the far, crossed his mind. The face of Robert Baratheon, the terrified eyes of the Rogers, the squire whose throat he had cut a lifetime ago in the Stormlands. All of it, everything. And then Warrior was leaping off the rise of the bank towards the icy waters of the Trident, the lead elephant encompassing Aelor's vision as it tried to step up the bank. He had mistimed his charge. The plan had been for most of the war beasts to clamber up the bank before Aelor and his men hit them. All of a sudden his broad charge had been shrunk into a not-so-broad window, but Aelor didn't let it concern him. He had no idea what would happen behind him. But it didn't matter. All that mattered was the armored elephant to his front, an archer on its back drawing back an arrow aimed at Aelor, its eye vulnerable, obviously uncovered by the armor protecting its forehead and flanks. The dragon of Duskendale roared as he struck with the boar spear in his right hand with the strength and accuracy of a born warrior, his mount and body airborne as he drove the steel head deep into the elephant's eye socket. The arrow fired by the archer atop its back deflected off the white flames of his helmet, the world in slow motion as he released the thick shaft of the spear. He nearly lost his seat atop Warrior as the old destrier crashed into the shallow icy water, Aelor having only been held to the horse by his stirrups during the leap. His rear collided with the saddle again viciously hard, but Aelor paid it no mind, already gripping the second spear as the first elephant's agonized trumpet filled the air. It was as if he had leapt into a forest where the tree trunks were gray, rough and moving. The gray of elephant hide and white of ivory tusks were everywhere, their armored sides broad. Instinct and his years of training took over, that same instinct and years of training that had allowed him to strike the lead elephant a fatal blow. His second spear was not as lucky, embedding in the armor a few inches below another elephant's throat. Aelor drew his blade, hacking away at the back of elephant knees and the straps of saddles. Another arrow from one of their riders deflected off of his right shoulder plate, a third off the thick mail of warrior's neck. His destrier bellowed and roared his disdain for the great gray beasts surrounding him, more than once attempting to take a bite out of their thickly hided legs. Aelor swung and swung, was covered in a freezing splash of water as somebody brought another of the animals down. It was unlike anything he had ever done, yet still all the same, the dragon of Duskendale desperately striking not at enemy swords and unprotected throats but instead saddles and legs. He didn't know how the battle fared, if his charge had done any good at all, but it didn't matter. He struck and struck and struck again, lost in the forest of gray. He and warrior both felt the presence too late. Aelor shot his head around to the left, his destrier trying to turn his body away, but the elephant was already too close. Aelor didn't know which of them, him or the elephant, were pointing the wrong direction, but it unceremoniously sank its sharpened, curved ivory tusks into warrior's flanks, the force of the charging animal driving the tusks through the chainmail blanket. His trusted mount roared, this time in pain, as Aelor wrapped a hand around his neck in half a hug, to keep himself atop the stallion as the elephant picked them up into the air as if they were nothing, tossing them aside like a child done with a toy. The dragon of Duskendale came out of the saddle and lost his grip on warrior during the flight, his body lost in a world without definition before he crashed down into the icy water. Both the impact and the cold water would have knocked the breath from Aelor's lungs. So the two of them combined certainly accomplished the feat. His mind spun, breath coming in long gasps as he tried to right the world that had so suddenly become upside down. Splashes crashed all around him, an elephant's foot landing mere inches from his head and tossing a wave of the shallow water into his helm. Aelor swallowed a lungful of the stuff, still trying to gasp for the air his body so desperately needed, and was greeted with the terrifying need to cough compounded with the need to breathe. If you had told the dragon of Duskendale he was dying in that moment, he would have believed you. Mindlessly crawling through the water, trying to both breath and hack up the water in his lungs, all thoughts of battle lost. He didn't know if it was water dripping from his nose or blood. His ears were ringing, his head throbbing. Aelor didn't know how he ended up at warrior's side, but the stallion that had been one of his oldest friends was suddenly in front of him. The white dragon finding his wits again as he pulled his body up against his stallion. His chainmail blanket had come up to drape over the saddle, revealing the two deep wounds that were hemorrhaging blood. Even if those could be staunched and were survivable, his front legs had been snapped in the fall, the right with the bone jutting out through his black skin. The old warhorse was game even in his death, and Aelor had to lean back out of the way as the great beast tried to stand up despite his wounds. But of course his legs couldn't hold any weight, and thrice the great beast fell back into the shallow waters before he stopped trying. Aelor started to lay his right hand on warrior's neck, only then realizing he still gripped his sword. Instead he laid his left hand in its place, shield askew but still strapped to his arm. Warrior threw his head towards Aelor, flat teeth bared as if he intended to bite the white dragon's head off. He stopped, though, as his pained eyes registered who it was that touched him. The destrier didn't scream in pain, didn't try to rise again. Instead, he bent his muscled neck to nuzzle Aelor's helm twice, air escaping his lungs in a heavy sigh and washing over his master's face, before the great stallion lowered his head back down flat. A rider leapt the body of broken-hearted man and broken-bodied horse, throwing water over them both. Warrior remained still but breathing as Aelor released his sword, drawing instead the emerald dagger on his belt. Warrior knew what Aelor was doing. The destrier had asked for it. The warhorse lay still, breath still coming, as his rider slipped the dagger under his chainmail blanket to his chest. "You were a great warrior, old friend. The seven will fight over which one gets to ride you." Aelor sank the long-bladed knife deep into the dying stallion's heart. His old friend pulled in a quick breath before his body went still, his last breath leaving his lungs in one last roar. The mercenary didn't have time to react when a dark figure rose from beside a dead horse with a great cry, water flying from it in droves as its blade decapitating the member of the Golden Company. Aelor roared as his stallion once had, tearing into the Golden Company infantry as they slogged across the corpse-strewn water, cutting one down, disemboweling another, turning one's face into a mess of rearranged skin and bone with his shield, roaring all the while. Aelor drove his blade into a sellsword's guts, feeling more than seeing the battle enveloping all around him. He didn't know if any or all of the elephants were alive, didn't know if Aegon had already broken. All Aelor could think of was one thing, and he yelled it over the din of battle, voice booming like thunder. Viceroys! He finally understood what his brother had meant when he claimed war was hell. There was no sense to this, no defined lines. Enemies came from all different directions, some trying to kill him and others looking like they were desperately trying to find a way out of the bloody mess. Viserys tripped over corpses, nearly lost his life to a peasant with his guts hanging from his belly. He'd lost his horse mere seconds into the conflict. A knight in the colors of house went chopping its legs out from beneath it. Viserys had only been saved by his Kingsguard, who had killed the knight and dismounted their own horses to slog it out beside their king. He didn't know where he was, only that he wasn't in the river. More than once he caught sight of a downed elephant, yet he could still occasionally hear their trumpet call of pain, telling him there was still at least one on its feet. His brother and nephew had pulled a nasty little trick, the golden dragon catching a brief glimpse of the white as he leapt into the water, driving a boar spear into the lead elephant's eye. His enemy's right hadn't begun to roll as Viserys had planned, a torrent of knights meeting the Golden Company's charge, pouring around the elephant's feet like a river around rock. But he saw all of that before he, at the center, entered the fray in the center of the lines. After that he'd lost all picture of the battle as a whole. It had become a bloody, filthy fight for life. He heard the voice again, distant and nearly incomprehensible over the din of battle. So faint the golden dragon told himself it was all in his head. Viserys, he drove Blackfire through the heart of a knight in gold and black livery, the smoky Valyrian blade piercing the steel of his breastplate with ease. The man's blood began to flow out of the wound as Viserys withdrew the blade, only to freeze before it even reached his waist. To his right Alester Strong brought his mace down savagely hard on a levy's head, the peasant's skull imploding from the massive blow. He had lost one of his Kingsguard, Hogo, a few feet or a few miles back. The golden dragon didn't know if the former sellsword was dead or alive or somewhere in between. There was no organization to this bloody mess. It was a brawl of blood and frost and snow, corpses starting to freeze as soon as they hit the ground. The voice came again, seemingly closer but still faint. Viserys, he sliced the legs out from underneath a screaming peasant levy, bashing another full in the face with his shield. His surviving 3 Kingsguard had formed something of a wedge around him, Sir Gerald Hasty at his front, Ormond Cole his left and Alester Strong his right, and the 4 of them were making their way over the countless bodies dead and dying. Viserys had no clue where they were in relation to their starting positions, had no clue if they were marching towards where Aegon had been or back towards where his own lines supposedly lay. But wherever they went, they found more men to kill. Parry, parry, strike. He killed, he yelled, he fought, all while the voice grew closer and louder. Viserys, Viserys, Viserys. He was in the middle of disemboweling a man-at-arms when he heard it the last time, suddenly as crystal clear over the din of battle as if it had been screamed directly in his ear. Viserys, the king of the Iron Throne, had barely managed to turn, his Kingsguard turning with him before his brother was upon them. The white flames of his crest were crimson in blood, his black armor covered in gore and mud and ice. Hasty stood no chance, having just started to turn when Aelor's sword drove through the damnable weak spot between breastplate and helm, stabbing in and out quick as a viper strike. He staggered forward before falling to his knees and slamming face first into a corpse. Aelor had withdrawn the sword before Hasty even realized he was dead, and the man who had saved a young Viserys' life was raining down blows on Ormond Cole with a ferocity Viserys had never seen. Alester stepped forward and brought a mighty blow of the mace down, but Aelor sidestepped and slammed his shield into Strong's helm, sending the massive bodyguard staggering a few steps. It was all the time Aelor needed to finish Cole, who fell to the snow desperately trying to stench the flow of blood from his slit throat. Alester came at Aelor like a charging bull, but Aelor gracefully spun around the youth and his swinging mace, bringing his sword in a backhand blow that missed Strong's back by mere centimeters. Alester had stopped, turned and barreled back, roaring and swinging quicker than light, but not quicker than Aelor. The third and final of his Kingsguard was impaled by his own momentum, Aelor having stepped forward when Alester was turning. The young warrior's aggression had been his undoing. Finding the older and more experienced killer was inside his guard only after the blade burst out his back. His massive legs didn't stop turning for a moment, Aelor's armored boots digging troughs in the snow as Alester pushed him along despite the hand of the king being braced against his broad chest. But the strength slowly left them, and soon enough Alester Strong sank to the ground. Brother met brother's eyes then, as the demon who had so easily dispatched a king's Kingsguard withdrew his blade from the last of their corpses. And like a nightmare come to life, Viserys was alone with Aelor. His brother started towards him in measured, calm steps. His shield was at the ready, the ruby-pommeled sword that had ended so many lives aiming to add a fellow Targaryen's blood for the first time. Viserys, having only been able to watch in shock and terror, as the man who had raised him eliminated his Kingsguard, managed to raise his own shield and Blackfire, though every nerve in his body told him to run. He was no match for the dragon of Duskendale, and they both knew it, but no one would follow a king who fled in fear. No one would follow a dead king either. But no matter their differences and transgressions against the other, the same blood coursed through Viserys' veins that coursed through Aelor's, and the third son of Ares held his ground against the second. Viserys brought the attack to Aelor as he had so many dozens of times in the tiltyard. And the same now as it had been then, his older brother knocked aside Viserys' blade with seeming ease. Viserys caught his counterattack on his shield, the impact jarring his arm. The king stayed light on his feet, darting another strike that the hand deflected before Viserys stepped back swiftly. He nearly tripped on the body of Gerald Hasty, barely managing to deflect Aelor's strike as he stumbled. The older of the brothers instantly took advantage, swinging his shield with what seemed like the force of a battering ram into Viserys' face. The golden dragon saw stars and tasted blood as he was sent stumbling by the blow, crashing into the churned snow on his shoulder plate. He clawed his way forward as quickly as he could, almost careening back to the ground several times before he regained his balance. He turned just in time to see the white dragon's sword flying in from above, barely jumping out of the way of the blood-coated blade. Almost as soon as he avoided that strike, it was coming back with another, accompanied with a roar from the demon-made man wielding it. Blackfire caught that one, then the next, as the white dragon drove the gold steadily back. Viserys was panting, nearly all of his strength focused on keeping his elder brother's sword at bay. He was constantly on his back foot, nearly tripping on several more corpses, his retreat a jerky, unkingly thing. In contrast, Aelor strode relentlessly forward, strikes precise and seeming to only strengthen, using both sword and shield as a weapon as he resorted to sheer aggression. Viserys soon was bleeding from half a dozen cuts to the joints of his armor, quick enough to deflect the blows or move out of the way before real damage could be inflicted, but not skilled enough to avoid his brother's blade entirely. He could only last so long. A particularly vicious blow knocked his blade up and out a centimeter too far away from his body, and Aelor had driven his blade into the opening before Viserys could get his shield all the way around. The king of the Iron Throne cried out in pain as his brother's blade bit into his upper arm, driving through the chainmail under the plate and cleaving the bone and tendon. The golden dragon's arm went limp, blackfire falling from his nerveless fingers as the white withdrew the blade and slashed it across the side of his leg, bringing Viserys crashing to a knee. The king of the Iron Throne brought his shield up with his one good arm as his own blood froze to his armor, but 3 horribly strong strikes from a devastating angle soon sent it crashing away like all his hopes of survival. Violet eyes bore into violet eyes as Viserys looked up to the man who had both saved and killed him. He wasn't angry, and that in and of itself was significant. Moments earlier, the focus of his rage had been to kill the man who had indirectly murdered his daughter. That anger had allowed Aelor to carve through Viserys' Kingsguard like a cake, none of the men a match for him in that moment. That anger had powered his sword arm to swing again and again and again, driving his enemy farther and farther back, wearing the false king down as he landed small strike after small strike, bleeding him slowly. That anger had allowed him to strike hard and true, piercing chainmail and cleaving bone in his enemy's shoulder and then carving into his calf, bringing that murderer to his knees. And in that moment when the goal of his rage was about to be reached, that anger was gone. It suddenly wasn't a false king on one knee staring up at him, but a silvery-haired child with eyes much like Aelor's own. It was a small bundle clutched to the breast of Aelor's long-dead mother, a small boy pretending to be a horse for the amusement of his smaller sister. While Aelor knew it was a man in front of him, a man who had killed others both with sword and command, all he could see was a child. Viserys didn't shirk back, didn't look away. Fear was in his eyes to be certain, but so was a resignation, a serene look of acceptance. He knew he was dead, knelt bleeding in the snow with neither sword nor shield at the mercy of a man who he had betrayed so thoroughly, but he didn't plead for mercy or cry for help from whatever remained of his men around them. He simply stared back into Aelor's eyes. And the dragon of Duskendale realized it was the first time in his life that Viserys had ever been able to hold his gaze. Whatever his brother's faults, whatever his eccentrics and quirks, he was meeting his death head-on. And despite all that had transpired, despite the death of his eldest daughter, Aelor realized he couldn't be the one to deliver it. Twice Aelor Targaryen had had the opportunity to kill a brother for the good of the 7 kingdoms. And twice, with Rhaegar at Harrenhal and now Viserys mere feet from where Rhaegar had fallen, he had failed. He was just lowering his shield when Viserys' eyes darted to the side, looking behind Aelor's back. He had been so focused on his baby brother that he hadn't sensed the man closing in behind him, years of battle-tested instincts failing him. The dragon of Duskendale tried to twist around, tried to bring his shield far enough back to knock aside a thrust or catch a slash, but he knew even before he got halfway that it was too late. And then a third presence materialized out of nowhere, catching the oddly shaped blade being thrust straight at Aelor's spine and knocking the blade up. A man with black and crimson armor, 7 red gold spikes adorning his helmet like a crown, placed himself between the dragon of Duskendale and the short foreigner wearing the white of a kingsguard, his pointed skull bared to the falling snow and freezing wind. Before the former mercenary could overcome his shock, the true king of the Iron Throne had parried the blade, knocking it from the Jogo's Enhai's hands. One vicious swipe of the king's sword sent the would-be dragonslayer's head bouncing across the bloody ground, the odd shape of his cranium making it roll jaggedly at different angles until it came to rest against the body of a downed horse. King Aegon VI turned to face his uncle as the torso of the foreigner collapsed to the snow. Aelor could only nod, knowing the boy he had saved as a child had now saved him. Aegon returned it. And Aelor knew his nephew was smiling under his visor. The two facets of Targaryen power turned to regard the fallen king in front of them, Viserys too weak to have moved in the small amount of time the foreigner's death had bought him. Aelor realized Aegon's Kingsguard was surrounding them, holding off any attempts by surviving men from Viserys' army to rescue their wounded monarch. The 3 Targaryens were in their own little bubble. Time frozen as 2 of them decided which would kill the third. Aegon leaned in close to Aelor's ear, voice rough. "You must die." The dragon of Duskendale nodded. "I know, but I cannot do it myself." The king nodded, peering once more at Viserys, whose eyes were beginning to droop from the loss of blood from the half-dozen minor and 2 serious cuts. The king took several steps towards the prince who had tried to usurp him, scooping down to reverently wrap his fingers around the grip of Blackfire, the smoky blade returning to its rightful place in the hand of a true Targaryen monarch. Aegon seemed to inflate as he lifted the sword, rising up to his full height to stare down at his enemy before him. Then he abruptly turned and strode away. Aelor turned and stared after him confusedly until his eyes settled on what stood waiting just behind them. Sir Roland Storm, brother to the man whose murder at Viserys' hand had helped lay the foundation for the conflict they now fought, was covered in blood, white armor turned crimson. He and Arthur Dayne had returned to the army only half a day before they had marched out to face Viserys. Aegon walked past him with only the smallest of nods, the king raising his own defenses as he readied to rejoin the carnage around them, but it was all the big man in white armor needed. He began forward, sword and mace at the ready. Aelor didn't watch. He followed his nephew, throwing himself back into the battle that was growing more and more vicious. Despite the loss of the Golden Company's claimant, but even over the shouts and screams of the dying and the clash of steel, he heard Roland Storm's strike land.